start. Hello, good morning. Thank you for being with us to the second conversations on the exhibition on mothering. For the version in Spanish, you can follow us on Facebook Live in MUAC.
Sorry, for English version or the original one, in this case, it will be in the YouTube channel at MUAC Live. I hope I said it correctly. So this conversation will be, we're super happy to have here Claire Fontaine and Prashani Naidu. And the conversation will be in English, as Fulvia is the common language between Fulvia and I am Prashani. So the conversation will be in English. And as I say, we're very happy and pleased to have Claire Fontaine with us, and we will explore a little bit more about that, because their work was just like a fundamental space for us to make this exhibition and to think about all the issues around mothering and freedom and care and work. So before I start, I just will present both of our guests. So Prashani Naidu is the director of the Society, Work and Politics Institute at the University of Witwatersrand since 2019. And she's been working with us for the last couple of years, trying to make some kind of entity or something that is called NAWAC. And it exists and it doesn't exist at the same time, but we've been doing some seminars and some gatherings to try to think about the politics of time and the time of politics. So it's been amazing to work with her the last times that were very uncertain, and it was like a touch base to try to think together and to raise some questions around politics, feminism, care, work, and that. And Claire Fontaine is a collective that was founded in 2004, and Claire Fontaine is named after a brand of French notebooks and stationery in an attempt to identify the transformed position of the artist. Claire Fontaine has conceived the ready-made artist, and they live now in Palermo. So thank you, Fulvia, for being here. So just want to say some words before starting with you, Fulvia. So for us, one of the moments of, as we explained yesterday, this exhibition is part of a research and a longer conversation between Alejandra and I, in which we were sharing some anxieties around motherhood and how it was possible to have this kind of what we have called a secret pact of patriarchy, and in which we didn't know all the things that happen in mothering. And at some point we got your text. I guess it was because of Cuauhtémoc Medina that he was curating at that time the Shanghai Biennial with you guys participating in it. And we were making a reader, and I got this text, Raising the Uprising, that you can read in the catalog of the exhibition, that it's you can download it for free in the website of the museum. And it was just like, boom. It was like a bomb in our brains. And in the text, you propose that a new pact between genders must be based on a new sentimental education that allows love and freedom to be recovered as emancipatory forms. In that frame, motherhood is proposed outside the reproductive work cycle as a creative activity. In that experience, you argue that there's a capacity to love in a non-accumulative and non-capitalist way, and that mothering can be a vital source for feminism. For these non-capitalist relationships, there must be a recognition of the activity of women beyond the reproductive work and outside the stories and organizations generated by romantic love, where the energies and of our doing that are not renewable, that is another thing that you're very clear in the text, that the the energy that we as women invest in life and work, both reproductive and productive, it's not renewable, can be recharged, reinvented, and cared for. For that, what we need to free ourselves for the gender dynamics of means and ends of love and care, of the aims of accumulation of labor. And the human strike is a tool for that emancipation. A strike as a form of subjectivization that allows other relationships within life. So, or with life. So it's, for us was very important, this argument, because like then motherhood appeared as a possibility for emancipation and a possibility for having like other forms of relationship, not only with ourselves, but with our kids and with the world. So it was like a political moment of motherhood or mothering that we found that it was amazing. And also in the text, there is a deep and heavy critique of labor and work in Marxist terms. So I would like would ask you, Fulvia, that you start like talking about that and the thoughts that you've been working on recently, and then we can connect some questions from Priyashani that she has been working a lot around these issues as well, and the public, of course, at any time that you want to come in the conversation, you do it, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Roshani, for having me, and Elena, really with your encouragement and enthusiasm. It's been really fantastic working with you, and we really truly regret that we can't see the show in person because we were supposed to come, but the circumstances are what they are. So thank you everyone for being here. So yeah, I will try to do my best. I mean, I have the terrible habit of keeping working on things and keeping elaborating them until the last minute. So Elena asked me, and she asked it again now explicitly, to depart from the text that we have provided as the contribution to the publication. And so, I mean, it's there to read, but maybe I can say something about it, especially about the way I see it now, because it's very strange how we see our work differently with the passing of time. I mean, we need to remember that we all change all the time, that we have to focus on our change more than on our identity and the aspect that remain the same. And so the text was firstly elaborated actually something like 8 years ago when my son was 1 year old. I was invited in London by Eleanor Rekit, and it was a sort of feminist symposium, and its title is then being transformed into the artwork that is our contribution in the exhibition. And this idea of women raising the uprising is both an idea of protagonism and an idea of service, of discretion, you know, and at the same time, it's something that really, I think, frees us from the idea of heroism in any ways, for women and for men and everybody else. So there are many possible ways of reading these texts. What I think is one that is still fertile now and inspiring for me is the idea of the emancipatory care that Elena was mentioning. And so the mothers, rather than representing the paradigm of the selfless sacrifice and self-exploitation, rather than appearing as the champions of the unpaid labor, can be seen as figures that provide an inspiration to society at large, because what they perform is what I call emancipatory care, which is a way of being a care provider that becomes day after day less necessary until it reaches its self-abolition. Because the mother who has done her work correctly is the one that is no longer necessary. She's no longer needed. She's going towards the abolition of herself as a mother, but especially towards the abolition of the logic of death. That is something that has plagued also feminist movements. There is a page, I've done recently a seminar with Eletta Stimilli, which is a dear friend and a specialist of death. We were invited in Milan by the ICA, this Philosophy and Contemporary Art School, and we gave this crazy talk about feminism and that, and then at some point all the students were really excited by the things that were coming up, and I read this page, which I often come back to, of Don't Believe You Have Any Rights. It's called Sexual Difference. It's a book by the Milan Women Bookstore, where feminists analyze the life where they say the counts are never square, we never break even. We're always kind of out of balance somewhere. There's never, let alone accumulating, but even the, the energy is coming in, going out is never even. And they say life we never break even. Yeah, that's how they say. And they say it's because we haven't resolved our debt with the mother, and we want to be as selfless as her. And so we realized this is a problem in militant structures, because women get so excited about what they're doing, and they get completely into it. They don't even pay attention to have personal return, to be able to continue doing the thing, because they are not interested in the personal return. They're just interested in this expansive, creative thing of gift, this permanent gift economy. And affirmative way, interesting way, is this idea that with the emancipatory care, what is different structurally and radically different from the ways of caring, and especially loving, that patriarchy and capitalism transmit, is that there is no idea of possession or domination. Domination is not a static situation, that one is more powerful and the other one is less powerful, because it's a dynamic between the child and the mother, because the child grows, so he or she must be growing to an adult. So there is this horizon of equality that is there, and then eventually even the possibility of the child becoming stronger than the mother herself. So this capitalism and patriarchy cannot understand this, because they are based on upon a negative idea of dependency, that we are all, whether we are in fact all dependent on each other. Our destinies are intertwined, and this is the only way to live life. There is no solitary and controlling, domineering journey that deserves the name of life. Patriarchal love, as I was saying, is based on the paradigm of possession. Motherhood, on the other hand, I would argue, is based on the paradigm of freedom. When criticizing the Hegelian origin of Marxist materialism as the cause of its gender blindness and its obsession with the productive labor over the reproductive one, Carla Lonzi affirms in Let's Spit on Hegel, that I hope will be translated soon into English at least, that women's oppression hides in the darkness of origins, and it resists historicization precisely because of historical materialism's own repressed memory of, I quote what she says, the emotional key that led us down to the passage to private property. The end of the quote. The first object that has been conceived by man, Lonzi states, is the sexual object. Therefore, the woman who gets to exist as a subject and not as an object of desire changes the course of this state of things, removing from the subconscious of the man his first prey, Lonzi says, untying the original knots of his possessive pathology. So the question of subjectivization and desubjectivization is crucial here, because it's at the heart of the concept of human strike that also Elena explicitly asked me to come back on, and is also part of the horizon and the construction of this originary text. The idea of human strike is inspired entirely by feminist struggles, I would say, in particular the non-reformist struggle that took place in Italy in the 70s, because what is specific and, in my opinion, very contemporary in these movements is that they were struggles to change not only one's professional or economic position. They were, like the decolonial struggles, ways of changing relationships inside society, of transforming the values through which reality was interpreted, and one's subjectivity is seen. So the horizon of the rights of the claim is, of course, present in these struggles, but what is more important is not to identify, and I will come back on this, essentially with the person that has been deprived of the rights and deprived of dignity, deprived of power. This identification is very detrimental, and it does block the horizon of the practice of freedom. It can still open up a practice of liberation, a practice of going towards something that will eventually free us gradually, but it blocks completely the horizon from the practice of freedom, which is something that I think is much more interesting, because it is like what the feminists of the Milan Women Bookstore call the practice of doing. The practice of doing things, like they were saying, practice of doing things amongst women, but they called it the practice of doing. It's a practice that one does in order to continue in practice. So, like, we have plenty of examples of practice of doing in our daily life, what Moten and Harney call black study, for example, is also a practice of doing. It's this kind of weaving, daily weaving, but it's also our reproduction, not only our biological reproduction, but the reproduction of ourselves as subjects. So what we do to maintain our capacity for freedom, our capacity for love, what we call the hope force, the struggle force, the love force, they're all reproduced because of the practice of doing, the multiple practice of doing. Love, of course, is the obvious practice of doing. You know, people love each other and stay in love with each other because they want to continue living this way, and it's a dynamic, of course, action of the practice of doing. I also live and work in my house. I call the women almost that have spoken, so I have intruders from all sides despite the doors that were closed, but it's fine. This a friend of mine was saying that this horizon of the room to one's own probably is not so important anymore, because with the dematerialization of everything, we just live in this continuous chaos, and it's fine. I mean, I'm okay with it. So going back to our point, I think there is one thing that I think is important in this idea of the general economy of how the oppressed are seen. Within capitalism, ownership of property replaces truth as a currency in relationships. I wrote these notes before Elon Musk bought Twitter, but then I thought how literal all of this was, that you just need to have the cash to buy a space for supposedly free speech. And there is no need of proving any moral or ethical excellence, like in the Hellenistic times, to claim a role of credibility. You know, you just need to have the cash and the power. And the election of Donald Trump was also another one of these examples. So people's credibility comes down to their economic credit. They have credit because they have economic credit, and not their capacity to harmonize what they say to what they do, their speech to their life form. But some political subject like women and descendants of indigenous, formerly colonized and enslaved people, whose status has been the one of being owned and traded like possessions, can't just speak as property owners themselves. Obvious, meaning that women are recently able to own assets and cash before they could not. So it's not only the right of vote that was precluded to them, but it's also these leftovers of objectification, this legacy of objectification that these figures that I've mentioned suffer, is to do with their economic status, which is obviously a symbolic status. So these Outside of the commodified and objectifying relationship, is the space where these struggles develop, the idea of human strike. It's a space that already exists within emancipatory care, for example, is the space of human strike. The logic of emancipatory care is not understandable for capitalism, because what kind of profit does one get from motherhood? Nothing. So this is really interesting. And without mothering or without care, without the practice of doing, we have no possibility for profit. We have no capitalism. I guess yesterday we were talking about the several $1 trillion of debt of the unpaid labor of care of women, and I'm sure also other figures that do this work of care. Well, it's not only the depletion of the resources, natural resources, and the exploitation of the formerly colonized population, but it's also this constant denial of where the possibility of making profit comes from, which is care, and free care, especially, not underpaid care, free care. Human strike is a movement through which we refuse to be complicit with our own oppression. Our subjectivities are productive and exploited in many ways, but they all require us to adapt to the behavior that is expected from us. One of the mottos of the Italian feminists in the 70s in Italy was, we don't believe what they say about us, refusing to identify with an idea of ourselves that degrades us in a form of human strike, and with that degrades us is a form of human strike. And it is the first movement towards the production of statements and actions that can acquire a different value, even in the eyes of the oppressor. As we know, at times the subalterns can't speak. So the very concept of subaltern needs to be revolutionized or abolished. This question is related to human strike, but it's strongly tied to the value of what we all do and say. And at this point, I was taken by a sort of vertigo, because I thought this question is my problem too, because it began to apply to my own activity of artist and researcher, which is tainted by its political orientation. And so I began wondering how, in particular, feminists had managed to transfigure their condition in order to change it every time that the historical circumstances for it were not reunited. And they still aren't reunited. As it was said yesterday, every day we build an acrobatic present. Every day work is not valued, or it's blocked, or it's problematic. It's not. It doesn't flow in channels and in ways that are open to remunerated labor. I have found the answer in this interesting knot between identification and subjectivization. So in the second tome of L'ennemi principal, this is called The Main Enemy. I believe it is translated properly into Spanish too, because it's an old book by Christine Delphi. It was initially written under a pseudonym. There's a chapter called Thinking the Gender. One of the two tomes is called Thinking the Gender, and the chapter is called Patriarchy, Feminism, and Their Intellectuals. So there, Christine Delphi explores the friable soil where her own research is setting its foundation. So as every feminist thinker, she knows that she speaks from a place where, in order to not refuse the identification with the subjects of work, the oppressed, women, and gender oppression, she must elaborate conceptual tools that extract her from both the position of inferiority that she denounces and the intellectual domination of the ones who speak about it using the language of the oppressor. One cannot be an anthropologist when talking about these things. One can depart from oneself, like the Milan Women Bookstore says. Otherwise, the discourse is devoid of value. Like Lonzi said, yeah, there are feminists who round up all these contents and then they sell it as the black market, as they pass it as mainstream knowledge, and she is totally against it. But it's a matter of understanding the perspective in which one is doing the research and providing the conceptual journey and the political journey. So for doing this action of identification with the subject of work, she traces the history of feminine deprivation within the intellectual and political field. And at the same time, she ties it to the possibility of thinking and speaking the truth in ways that are transformative. Delphi reflects on the differences between reformist and revolutionary feminists, and she concludes that the reformist feminists, like most left-wing militants, talk in the name of the oppressed without identifying with them. So the revolutionary feminists instead talk about themselves, their subjectivity, but they do so in a paradoxical way because they don't reclaim a space within the existing situation. They reclaim a radical change of what produces everything, including themselves as subjectivities, in order to be able to change themselves and others. So this idea of the human strike is the same idea that we find here when Delphi describes this need to rethink the circumstances in which one is thinking freedom. I don't know if what I'm saying is clear, but we can go back on it in the conversation. For many women, Delphi writes, the only possible alleviation of the oppression that they endure, as they can't escape it in reality, consists of an imaginary denial of this very oppression, which results into a denial of the pertinence for themselves of feminist struggles. Oppression is at the same time a reality and an interpretation of reality, a perception of reality as unbearable, which means precisely oppressive. This perception of reality as oppressive cannot be founded on reason, based on an analysis that at first would ignore it, then would discover it. There is no science that can tell us that we are oppressed. Oppression, which is the consciousness, becomes objective, which is the consciousness, becomes objective because it has been shared. This perception of being treated unjustly is more scientifically funded, isn't more scientifically funded than the notion of justice and equality. End of the quote. This was my translation, but basically Delphi argues that the experience and the shared experience of something is more important than the way it is formally codified. If the people that are in a particular condition feel that this condition is not the one they should be in, this is more important than what the rest of society says, essentially. I would like to tackle another part possible inside the text, that is social mothering. This is a particularly probably hateful and nasty part of it, but I think it's good to come back on this because in the text there is also this aspect of the acceptance by women, even inside the supposedly revolutionary militant structure, of patriarchal destructive behavior. So essentially my point of view about the mixed groups and the failure of the militant groups up to now to radically transform in any country in the world in the second half of the 20th century, since the second half of the 20th century, the political situation is caused by this problem of gender situation inside them. They are, most of them, plagued by patriarchal patterns, and women are complicit of these kind of dynamics. So there was one part of the text that spoke about it. And so I just wanted to say also a couple of words about the concept of reproduction at large, which is not only the reproduction of these dynamics, and is not only the mothering, but also the reproduction of ourselves and the relationships that allow us to exist. So about this point, I was doing some research about this concept of the infratine of Duchamp, which is a very fascinating concept because it is very connected to all the not only quantum physics, but all these researches on the microcellular life, that in every cell there is an inner life, etc., etc. So it wasn't miles away from what Duchamp was saying about this idea of the infra-thing. He gives the example of the warmth of a chair from which someone has just got up, of the tobacco smoke that comes out from the mouth and joins the one that is coming out from the nose, the slightest difference between two objects that makes one a potential ready-made and the other one just something to use trivially. These are some of the definition that he gives of the infra-thing. And what really interested me is that Bernard Marcadet, one of his biographers, says that this concept was elaborated in 1937, while Duchamp was busy making these painstakingly precise miniature copies of his artworks for the suitcase boxes, the boîte en valise. He made a sort of toy version of his work. You might have come across the pictures of it. And Marcadet says, literally, this discovery of his sensibility is deeply connected to his reproductive activity. The fact that he was reproducing these objects, and in the minute attention that he was putting in reproducing these objects, he came up with this idea of the infra-thing. So in order to change the balance between the productive and the politically meaningful work and the reproductive, supposedly apolitical one, we probably do need a different energetic reading of reality. This was also something that was very present in the text, because once we acknowledge the energies that have been put into care and into the unpaid labor, we can understand that the energy crisis is not only the one of gas and oil, but it's a little bit vaster than that. So while Duchamp, who took pride in his refusal to work, wrote about the infra-thing, he was also dreaming of channeling all these small energies that get wasted. There is a poem of his where he says that he wanted to build a transformer that could use the excessive pressure that sometimes is applied on an electrical button, the exhaling of the tobacco smoke, the hair and nails growth, the fall of urine and excrement, the impulsive movements caused by fear, surprise, boredom, anger, laughter, and the fall of tears, the demonstrative gesticulations of the hands, the feet, the tics, the hard stares, the arms falling from the body, and many more examples. So all these anti-industrial and ecological energies were very present, very perceptible for the idle person that Duchamp was. He was a man who refused the subjectivity of the producer in order to sharpen his artistic sensibility. The often repetitive and destructive work that is embedded into material and even immaterial production, when it is remunerated, is socially accepted and politically valued. Even today, on the brink of the environmental disaster caused by the unsustainable productive model we're in, the pride of the employed working class man and the authority of the intellectual male exerting his function in what used to be, for example, the Communist Party, or in a cultural institution, are based on a reputation that was itself created upon the accumulation of power. The aim of these figures that are not emancipatory, the worker, the intellectual, wasn't to transform the food chain, but to get to its top, because the value of their discourse, even when it was subversive, was created in the very places that the discourse was meant to destroy. There is a division of labor, even within the revolutionary politics, against which one must strike, where the revolutionary practices that are valued might be the ones that won't fundamentally change the status quo and, above all, patriarchy. I mean, there are some notes here that, as I was saying, are slightly hostile, that talk about the patriarchal contempt for the convivial, the social, the physiological aspects of life, the zoe, the phone, when not militarized, that it has historically taken the forms of professionalism and intellectualism, right? So it was disguised as a legitimate need for productivity, Men's disgust for children and the segregation of the family to the domestic sphere have burdened women with the schizophrenia of having their professional identity constantly shadowed by the domestic one, to which women and men are alike associated as a matter of fact. The remunerated workplace values itself precisely through the contempt for the informal and domestic one. The wage is being justified by a supposedly higher quality of the professional services provided in opposition to the effective work that is done for free, because it's owed to the ones who receive it for free. But the professional care work is only available because of the informal, unrecognized and unpaid one that takes place after work and reproduces the subject that will tomorrow provide the remunerated service. So this interdependency is hidden. I think without going in depth on this point, I think that the most important thing is the fact that the continuity between the paid work and the unpaid work is constantly hidden. It's constantly erased. So, and it's also, there's also one thing about the informal and free labor against which one cannot strike, of course, and the human strike can possibly provide a horizon to understand it as labor and change it, transform it, value it. So there's one note about this where said that disregarding the exploitation always translate into the criminalization for the most dispossessed amongst the dispossessed, so that their frightful example dissuades the others from going on strike. The success or the failure of the work of care as such lay in a private zone of the social body that stays unspoken and only emerges when the work could no longer be done and led to a tragedy. The abandonment of the dependent creature is regarded as cruelty, whilst the exploitation of the unpaid and helpless carer isn't. The tragedy The tragedy can't be prevented when care becomes unsustainable. The intellectual can happily profit from the credit that he gets from showing distance from the reproductive and material sphere of life, because the inclusive exclusivity of language has historically worked in a patriarchal direction, leaving unvalued the emotional work that granted the intellectual the sufficient mental balance to perform his speculative task, meaning that even the intellectual work that we use to enlighten this question is tainted by the question that Delphi finds herself in, which is this tool was born, it was mentioned briefly by Maggie Nelson yesterday, one cannot care for one's child while doing something else. To a certain extent, but performing intellectual labor, for example, requires a very specific type of concentration. So this contempt, this structural contempt within society and this separation of spheres is something that translates into the impossibility of a lot of figures to leave their exploitation, a situation of extreme exploitation, without being considered as cruel, without producing a tragedy. So this is the biggest tragedy of all. And the idea of human strike is to, in fact, enlighten the value of this subjectivity and not the devaluation of this subjectivity, and transform the position of disgrace into a position of importance, of main, fundamental, essential utility, even to perform the art and the intellectual tasks that look like the most distant from this work of service. I think we can just end probably on another note, which is pretty much what I was saying. Well, there is some very funny things by Zombertel that I have found in intellectual and manual labor, where he says that basically in the formation of consciousness, by the procedure of abstraction is exclusively a matter for the consciousness itself, then a chiasm opens up between the forms of consciousness on the one side and its alleged determination in being on the other. The historical materialist would deny, in theory, the existence of this chiasm. He would say he identifies with the object of his studies when he doesn't, but in practice has no solution to offer, none at any rate that would bridge the chiasm. Admittedly, it must be taken into consideration that the philosophical tradition is itself a product of the division between mental and manual labor. End of the quote. So reproductive labor is the creation, is instead, in our reading, the creation of situations that inhabit that chiasm, right? Because it is something that is done, in fact. And it can be intellectually conceptualized. It doesn't need to be conceptualized as a transcendence. It can be conceptualized as a practice of doing. It can be conceptualized as a form of immanent thinking. The relationship between private owners, according to Marx, is characterized by isolation and foreignness. And Zonrettel defines it as a practical solipsism. This is really interesting, I think, for our horizon of thought, because the ethics of private property come to life through exchange, which becomes the most common relationship and the main meaning killer within the field of knowledge and self-reflexivity. Exchange, he says, has its consequences because it is a relationship between human beings. They cannot relate to each other as they do to nature, for instance, killing and robbing each other as they do to animals. Instead, they must speak to each other, communicate by sign, or in any case, recognize each other as human beings. End of the quote. So this is a very good description of patriarchy, I think, and capitalism. This communication must anyway always signify and confirm, he says, the reciprocate exclusion from ownership, the principle of which can be summarized in mine, hence not yours, yours, hence not mine. Well, we clearly see that, for example, the paradigm of motherhood is the complete opposite of that, because all the children are made for society and they're given to society. So it is technically and practically the opposite of this logic that is behind, the structure of our whole society. So that's where the clash appears, and that's where the devaluation is painful, although we need to find ways to demonstrate it in practice and to put it on its head. Otherwise, we just endure it in the flesh, but we need to trust also this feeling, as Delphi says, because this feeling is more important than what they tell us about ourselves. So I will end here. It just says another thing that I really like, which is the commercial exchange is a social tie created by an activity that denies all social ties and claims the abstraction of property in which each owner of money and commodity can pursue his personal interest without ever having to think about society. The only truth that determines the issues at stake in commodity exchange is not what two people need or feel or think, but whose need, feeling, or thought will prevail. That's what shapes the relationship. I think I can end here and we can start the conversation if you agree.
Thank you so much, Fulvia. It's a lot to digest and so much that allows me to make more sense of the idea of the human strike. I mean, I have a few ways through which we can take forward our conversation, but I think I wanted to start or go back to where you started. I mean, you made the joke that claiming a room of one's own is becoming more and more difficult, and I think we saw Ariel with the blowing of the balloon earlier, trying to come in, and you're trying to negotiate your space to have this conversation. But I think, running through what you've presented today and the previous piece, Raising the Uprising, and that has been important for me in the shaping of my politics, from a place where the industrial worker and the industrial working class continues to hold a central place in the theorizing of how we can be, how we should be, even politically. And I think you're also very far from that point now in terms of what you're presenting, but I think it allows us, through the idea of emancipatory care that you've unpacked today, to think more carefully about this idea of autonomy. You haven't mentioned the word autonomy in your presentation today, but in the previous piece, Raising the Uprising, you speak about love as, or the love that we should celebrate, that we should cultivate in our lives, as one that is always respectful, careful of the autonomy of the other, and yet there's always, I mean, in that joke of, you know, not being able to claim the room of one's own, in the act of mothering, in the acts of care, always, you know, there's a tension there, I think, you know. So I wanted you to speak a little more about this idea of autonomy, or the concept of autonomy, that has to also, or that factors in these difficulties. And I think that for me anyway, present an idea of autonomy that is very different from the idea of the individual and the rights of the individual, and that kind of thing. And I think, or let me leave it there, and I'll come back to you know, what comes from that for politics and conceptualizations of self in relation to politics.
Yes, thank you so much for this question that is so graceful and polite, because while you were asking the question, I was, of course, noticing, and maybe I should say it explicitly, that I purposely left out all the aspects of violence that, you know, are the main cause of women's position within society, and capitalist violence that forces people to conditions of physical labor or exclusion. So in a way, this horizon that is there, I have a cat screening, I don't know if you hear, always speaking about the room of one's own, you know, there is no peace. But coming back to your question, you know, I had more notes here regarding the question of autonomy, and I think I don't know, it came to appear to me as a perspective that is sort of not so realizable in the world we're living in now, because it is so militarized. And so there's such a return of accepted brutality that when I was young, the way I was raised politically, I would have never thought there would be this kind of disaster. But maybe I tell to myself sometimes, it's just that we are much better informed, we have much more knowledge of what is actually going on today, although people complain a lot about misinformation and conspiracy theories. It's just we have a lot more of everything, so we can actually know better what is going on, the way we are able to follow the desperate war in Ukraine that is getting a lot more attention than other wars. But we can hope that it opens the path to giving the same attention to the other wars that are raging around the planet, has certainly trained sensibility of people. So this question of autonomy, to come back to your question, in these notes, I've written autonomy as a perspective is as seductive as riots can be, but it does not provide a viable model of struggle. It stems from a group where there are no children, no sick, no old or disabled people. And then the other notes I had underneath were about freedom that doesn't replace the idea of autonomy, but is another declination of how we can imagine an exit from this state of things that is also a mental state of things. You know, it's not only the struggle balance that we are under, but the way we use the space of freedom that are given to us. Because that's something that is fascinating, that before dictatorships occupy all the space and make it impossible to react for people, there is already a preventive fear and a preventive prudence that starts to appear briefly before that. And this is what we need to work on, because this is the margin that we have. The way we use the spaces of freedom that we have, the way we struggle to expand them, the way we claim them as owed, necessary, vital, essential, and we don't just disregard them because they don't look to be like they're very much used. Freedom, if it's not used, it perishes. It's one of these things that one needs to regenerate. So that's why I think this horizon is an interesting one, and it's a collective one, definitely. Regarding the room of one's own, yeah, probably now we do without it, and then we will, you know, go back to having one when it's possible. Why not? But freedom is more a matter of reproduction than of autonomy. I have here. It's less a question of severing ties and independency than it is of ensuring self-sufficiency. And like the work of care to which it's obscurely connected, the reproduction of freedom is a constant multiplication, a never-ending process. Liberation is a linear movement towards the end of subjection, a way of reaching collectively self-determination, and the practice of freedom is what comes after, because it's not a goal to reach, it's not an objective, it's a form of life. So it's the production of oneself, it's the production of one's own relationships, possibly the production of one's subsistency. That would be amazing, but it's also a relationship to one's environment as an open possibility, rejecting the internalized and normalized institutional violence and opposing the logic of the results, the achievement and the conquest that the touchstone for any progress. It was and construction as the only source of hope, because I mean, the practice of freedom is something else. In these notes, I also talked about the housing called Milana. That is one of the examples that I often quote in Don't Believe You Have Any Rights, which is translated as Sexual Freedom, this book of the Milan Women Bookstore, where they get this beautiful place to meet all together, and they spend a lot of time fixing it, and they have much better conditions to get together. And then once it's done, they don't have anything to say to each other, because all the women are paralyzed by the fear of creating a conflict by saying something that maybe wouldn't be liked by their sisters and comrades, and they prefer to find refuge in safer relationships, informal, more effective, and they sort of flee this political space where the divisions could happen. So in that case, defending the resources that they had was detrimental for their practice of freedom. So I just, maybe I've displaced the question, but I think it is.
Can I jump in, Rajani?
Can I just follow up on one thing, Elena? On the
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to stay with the idea of autonomy in terms of all the traditions that place at its center the practice of the refusal of work, or the politics of the refusal of work, which you've spoken about. And what was interesting for me was your turn to Duchamp and your pulling out that idea of a refusal of the subjectivization as a producer. I think that's what you said. So not to allow oneself to be seen, to become in ways that are defined and limiting through that idea of production or producer. And I'm wondering if your idea of emancipatory care then, and you keep coming back to reproduction as a space through which there is the possibility for what I would understand as a kind of autonomy that is produced through the creation of a different kind of community. So, you know, emancipatory care, and you've spoken about the abolition of the self over time, the abolition of that idea of the mother as a subject. You know, so is autonomy only possible in the coming to be with others, in new forms of community that are made possible through emancipatory care? And, you know, Helena, that I can throw this back to you as well then, because does that then challenge the idea that acts of production is what we should be looking towards? Or is it just a matter of language and the words we're using? Or is it that, you know, and you spoke also about representation and, you know, the ways in which we are seen by the world, but the ways in which we should situate shared experience at the center of our defining of self through, you know, a different idea of community. So I'm throwing it to both of you. But
yeah, I'm just gonna say a word that comes up to me it's wonderful how your questions bring up ideas in me that probably they're not, I mean, the ones that I should be bringing up, but it just makes me really think of the dynamics of identity politics, what you were mentioning, this actual, how would I say, reversing the contemptuous position that one holds within society into something that can be foundational, positive, beautiful, you know, transforming it, filling it with different values and making it matter in different ways, and at the same time deterring the people who don't belong to that particular group. And that's true also for feminist separatism, and not only for racial politics, but from joining.
I'm not sure, Helena, if you can hear, but my screen is Fulvia, your screen
you froze for a second.
Yeah, it's, I guess it's back now. So sorry. Obviously, I would like to believe that there is a possibility of not just gathering in resentment and not just pointing against the communal enemy and excluding these figures from one's field of existence in order to construct yourself as a community. But yes, I mean, acts of production and reproduction and the refusal to work, coming back to the question of the refusal to work, yes, I think the refusal to identify with the worker goes with this question of, for me, it's also, I mean, we can see the workerism, not the operaism. I'm talking about the working class, the history of the working class movement as a form of gigantic identity politics, right? And so, yes, there is a form of disidentification that I always quote this text of Benjamin about the critique of violence, where he is inspired by Sorel, and he described a form of strike that is for him the revolutionary one, in which the workers forget that they're workers. They live immersed in this new reality, which is the occupied factory, and the factory that has changed use. And or I use this example of the Medevkin collective that go and film inside the Peugeot factory and become filmmakers through filming their own situation at work with the help of Chris Marker and other filmmakers. You know, they find this other perspective on what they are and how they can see themselves. You know, of course, I mean, this all this operation is not an intellectual operation. It's an operation of thinking the relational through the ways that in the ways in the infra ways, in a way that they condition the relationship that we have with each other, because it seems not so problematic to identify with this or that, but we should think about the possible connection and the dynamics that this identification can cause. And that's where all the identity politics and the essentialism seem problematic to me as a horizon, not as a practice. But they're not practices of doing, because they can be only up to a certain extent. Because as a matter of fact, we need a horizon that is, how would I say, inclusive is not the word, but that shows awareness and shows being armed and ready to have a dialogue and a confrontation with what is not us, right? Because what is not us has made us us.
Can I jump in, Prashani, to follow that? I mean, I know that a point of debate between us has been like the idea of autonomy, as you come from a very important and important tradition of believing or thinking that autonomy can be a way of creating a community outside some formations of the state and to create some moments of politics. I'm being very general about autonomy. It's a very complex notion in terms of politics, but it's interesting for me, Prashani, that in the last readings that we have shared, like Maggie Nelson, Fulvia, and also like in another way, Anna Tsing with The Mushroom at the End of the World, they are talking about freedom. And freedom is not a notion that I paid attention before, I have to say. But like the last year, we've been going back and forward to the idea of freedom, and freedom as a form of also noticing other forms of being, isn't it? Like breaking with the idea of autonomy in order to also assume the existential condition of living with other beings and being other beings in ourselves. We were talking with a biologist in our seminar, remember, Prashani, with Eria the other day, talking about ajolotes and bacteria in frogs. So it was very interesting to realize that there's no autonomy as human beings. I mean, we live among other beings that transforms and in a way create ourselves. So I don't know, I was thinking that how interesting it is, I don't have a solution or anything, but how interesting it is that in the recent readings that we have shared, the common thing to reappropriate some notions of love and politics in relation with time and love has been freedom and maybe assemblage and collaboration and not autonomy. Maybe did this bring something also about the conditions of temporality? I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud of what it means to think about freedom in these terms.
Yes, I don't know if it's a question. It is definitely an open question for me. I mean, I don't think there is a precise answer, but what is definitely interesting is that the way I've been brought up, for example, in the autonomous movement in Italy, what was the autonomous movement up to a certain extent politically was, for example, that there is no need to believe what is described as the itinerary that one should follow to reach a point of freedom or to reach a better life. there is a total immanence, and this is a legacy of 77, a punk legacy in a way, because this idea of no future doesn't mean that there's going to be no future. It means let's focus on the present. The present is what determines the possibility of a future. So there are ways of thinking about the future that obliterate the present, and this is what most people do in a logic of work, in a logic of projection, in a logic of delaying things. So the practice of freedom, for example, the way Foucault describes it, is something that creates the present, that creates the we. He says we can say now, when we can say we, you know, I as a singular person cannot say now. The present is something collective. So it is, I think, a very important point that we don't see freedom as a luxury, but that we see freedom as a condition of a meaningful life and the possibility of being listened to, of making sense to. Because if we don't have this minimal freedom, which is a collective, again, journey and a collective practice, we can't be heard. So we don't have dignity even in front of ourselves. That's what I'm trying to say, because the authorities that grant you dignity, they're not dignified themselves outside this process of emancipation and this practice of freedom. This was the point that I was trying to make when I was talking about the discourse of emancipation, because here we're talking, so we are using how would I say, intellectual categories to try to affect our bodies, to experience the possibility. So this intellectual discourse is something that needs urgently to escape from the zones in which its authority is granted by the very mechanism that destroys its legitimacy. So it's not a matter of being obsessed with being recuperated or being co-opted or being, it's much different. It's something much more intimate. It's understanding the value that one's discourse could have to transform the use value, what I call the existential use value of a position in a discourse. So I don't know if what I'm saying is clear. It's not abstract at all. It's actually something very practical, but it doesn't help being on Zoom with a screaming cat behind the door, but we try to do what we can.
Yeah, I mean that's great, because I mean it brings me also to something you started with that I wanted to ask you about. You know, you said, you know, they say the subaltern can't speak. We need to destroy the subaltern, and I think that you know, it's not just intellectual discourse that you're motioning towards, in that I think you're also speaking about, or the way I'm reading you, it's or hearing you is also an idea of life that is able to be made outside of structures of representation. So for me, that, you know, that idea of the subaltern can't speak is precisely being trapped within the structures of representation. And the idea of emancipatory care that you're presenting in the discussion of subjectivization, desubjectivization in relation to the human strike, then I think poses the problem of you know, that the practices of freedom that are possible or not possible at the moment, in terms of the centrality of the state, the party, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, you know, as artists, then also caught up in these structures of representation in a different kind of way. You know, how do you make sense of your relationships to a possibility or the living of emancipatory care in the constitution of new communities, but possibly also new political communities?
Well, that is a big question. It's a serious one, and I mean, I don't know if I should answer on a personal level, but I think that being artist is already, I mean, being artists in ways that are not realistically minded, you know, not catering to an existing market and just coming up with crazy ideas, basically, and allowing these ideas to be part of the world, you know, transforming the world by introducing the incarnation of this idea, the actual objects that can make this idea survive in a different context from where it's been first found. So, like, part of our work, for example, is to displace meanings and emotions and affects and put them into the exhibition space, often of political origins, and having the viewer or the people who experiences the work living a different emotion and being affected differently by this fact that is presented in the work or evoked in the work or included in the work. So for me personally, my work is an evidence of love of humankind, you know, because for me it's a gift, and I could do something. I could not actually, but on paper one could do something easier or more satisfactory or with a smoother path that doesn't have to dig into these painful and conflicted zones, even painful for us who do it. And I don't have to work with someone else. I don't have to disubjectify and question authorship, you know, but I do all these things because for me they are gestures that open path, if not symbolic, actually, yeah, an experiential path towards. They show another possibility as a simulation, you know, as a line of flight. Then again, on a daily basis, of course, women are masters of inventing freedom when there is absolutely nothing and there's no hope. So I trust them to continue teaching me and the world that wonderful things are possible. And I try with some friends, you know, also a collective that works on this idea of human strike. We've been unfortunately meeting online, but probably if the pandemic had never happened, we wouldn't have started this journey. And yeah, I mean, there are plenty of possibilities. I think the future is full of needs, strong needs for getting together, for reinventing a daily life, even just on an emotional, on a bacterial level. I mean, we can't continue living like this. So on a biological level, I mean, as we all need a change, it is possible that even if it's not authorized by the structures that should foster it, it will take place anyway. So maybe we should be optimistic in this respect, because I think we have started to value each other in new ways in these past 2 years, and we have definitely had all of us to understand that we are all interconnected. No.
Fulvia, can I open to the before we end with the questions of the audience? So there's a question of Cuauhtemoc that he sends his highs to you and Prashani. And he says that, I'm going to read it. I'm impressed with the way Fulvia brought Duchamp to look beyond the position of autonomy, heteronomy, and to a certain extent, the idea of class identity based on antagonism. Are you suggesting an idea of freedom that is less negative and somehow related to the notion of freedom as the agency of an engagement?
What is the agency of an engagement? I mean, that I have a doubt about that. But definitely, yes, there is a strong mourning of the idea of conflict as a foundational idea, or at least not of conflict, but of the enemy, right? Because there is more need for complexity as the enemy is dematerialized, and everywhere I think that the very concept of human strike itself was born out of the mourning of this, you know, binary logic of good people against bad people, poor people against rich people. We understand that unfortunately the situation is much more fragmented than that. So the human strike tries to see which part of ourselves is complicit with the situation we are in. And so it fragments even the class, you know, the class assignation of everyone, but also the gender identity, problematizes identity as something that we don't master. So it questions identity as the starting point of a real process of emancipation. It actually says, well, you know what, maybe this subjectivization is more interesting because it's probably our identity what has caused us all the trouble, and how did we get assigned this identity? To which extent are we the protagonists of this identity? And then with the crisis of the counter identifications that could be the structure of the party, you know, that like the institutions that could provide a legitimacy for opposing the enemies within society, all these structures collapsed. So now we are obviously left with this this need of defining ourselves in opposition to what hurts us, but at the same time with the awareness, the deeper awareness that we are connected, obscurely connected to what is hurting us and what is oppressing us. And I think women with you know, always lived in a patriarchal society know a thing or two of this situation. You know, they know about being in love with their oppressor, and they know about not wanting to apply the dialectics of the slave and the master of Hegel, and then you know, that animated the idea of the class struggle in Marx, to the conflicts that shape their lives. And I think that Spit on Hegel of Lonzi is a book of incredible conceptual relevance in this respect, because it really shows how struggle is much more complicated, and how also is not only a matter of material subsistency and recognition of one's identity, but it's also a matter of pleasure. And there are deep motivations that have to do with the emotional survival, sexual pulsions, and this is not pathologized like in psychoanalysis. This is taken into account as just a fact. It has got as much reality as somebody's salary. And I think this is a very, very important way of posing the questions, broadening the scope of what are our claims and our needs and our subjective components that that make us decide politically in one sense or another. And now we can complexify all this, and we can also probably find stronger unions that can be more constructive between people outside of the horizon of the communal enemy. Because when groups are fragmented, although they have the same aim and the same enemy, they don't get anywhere. So I am optimistic about these new ways of conceiving it's frozen again.
Yeah, it froze a bit. Well, just like kept with the argument, just saying like I mean something like the freedom of commitment, I think, associate or accept a certain situation. So I think in a way, I mean, it's a very different kind of approach, isn't it? Of politics as well, like trying not to think about antagonism or disagreement, like in this kind of Rancierian kind of terms, but like going also to rethink desubjectivization in the sense that it's not easy. Like we talk all the time about subjectivity and how to change subjectivities, and it seems like it's an easy thing to do, and it's like a very complex forms of sensibility that are part of history and are embedded in us in the way we open things and we see things and we think things. So I was thinking in the importance of the strike, like these years of the pandemic, at least one of them, and the worst one, I think, I was like in this kind of path of going into a strike, in a personal strike, in a love strike. So I put on strike my relationship at the time. Like I was on strike on my maternity as well. Like, of course, I was not a strike. I was like taking care of my kid, but I was trying to make some kind of separation of the identifications that were put on me in a way. So I think that's how I understand the idea also of freedom. I mean, of course, we're not free. We live with lot of constraints, but there are some forms of refusal that I think they're so important in your idea of the strike. At least for me, has been like a thing that is there, like, should I go into strike with this, and how it will operate in my own subjectivity and ways of living in a way.
Yes, most definitely. I mean, coming back on what you were saying, I mean, for example, right, very simple, how we need to trust our experiences and how the experiences of political militant groups is that everybody knows that when there is a fight inside a political group or a collective or even a feminist collective, I have this dream of writing a book just about the fights that made collectives explode, because there's no knowledge or transmission of all this. You know that people divorce and they go, as you said, strike in their couple, or they can't take their kid anymore and they have breakdowns, or they leave them. These things are codified. But the systematic reasons for example, our biggest enemy becomes the comrade or the friend that has betrayed us or has done something that has upset us. And then at the end of the day, the communal political horizon becomes like pointless. We are much more inclined to be indulgent with our fascist neighbor that we don't care about than we are demanding with our comrade or feminist sister that has disappointed us, because there is this space of extreme demand where these needs for political meaning and reciprocal recognition are so heavy, so intense. And so, this is something that we need to consider, because it has been very destructive through time. Family is an example of that, but I care less in a way, because now everybody knows that, for many, many reasons, family is fucked up and is enduring a lot of transformation, and it's a space where people need to be creative and they really need to see each other. The roles are not that relevant anymore, and it's just a matter of being realistic. And I mean, you can't get advice from your 3-year-old, but you can definitely codify what he is saying. We have a lot of pedagogical tools for that, and it's very often very helpful, because when they have a tantrum, it's a tantrum for a situation in which we are also involved and complicit of. It's something that went wrong. It's not just him being annoying, it's the relationship going through a crisis. So this relational reading, I think, is systematically applied to family, because the institutional role of family has perished. But what, for example, is missing is imagining what this could become in collective formation. How can we not reproduce the same mistakes of oppressing each other with our expectations that we have, that the other person can finally free us from the misery of the life we are living in? Well, actually, no, we should work on this together. But I mean, for me, this is human strike is as simple as that, because our instincts sometimes are not the best advisors in terms of what we do in relationships to make them emancipatory on a larger scale, and for ourselves ultimately, because they might also compromise them.
So there's another question, but it's in Spanish. It's long, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to translate it, but I'll do my best. So after a reflection on patriarchy as not a person or a group, but more like a spirit of the time, of our common time. She or he, I don't know, or them ask, the question is, if a proposal of reconciliation or conciliation wouldn't be more assert or better than a contraposition, bellic contraposition, like looking for options as integration, collectivity, filiation, and if there is an equilibrium between that intention and the demands of transgression that the artistic creation suppose.
Well, if your translation is accurate, my answer is no, hell no. I mean, we can't just forget about the fact that the door has been open after centuries that it was closed, and that there hasn't been any changes made in the room where we've been let in, that was built to let us out. So what are we going to do in that room? Meaning that, for example, in this book that I have quoted already a million times, this Sexual Difference book by the Milan Women Bookstore, they talk about the resource of the exteriority to society, right? They say, there's a fantastic expression, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but they say, we found the words to say that our inferiority was the result of an abuse of power. It's something absolutely incredible. They have found a way of saying that, of getting themselves out. I have this expression like the Baron of Munchausen, you know, he gets himself out the quicksand by pulling his own ponytail, you know. So women say, you know what, no, you know, this is just, but women, you know, as Federici says, women are, another name could be excluded of a situation, but that are participant in it. Women are not excluded technically from society, they've always been there. It's just a matter of reversing the perspective on what their you know, their segregation was, and how their love was used against them, for example, as a tool for slavery, when it was there, or what they've called love that wasn't love, you know, for centuries. And all these things can be renegotiated, and they shouldn't for any reason be forgotten. And yes, we've got to reconcile. Of course, we've got to reconcile because we have to live together, but we won't reconcile until we've been understood. I mean, I'm not reconciling with somebody that is once again abusing me, because that is not human strike, that's self-destruction. It's the opposite of what I'm saying. You know, I can't escape my role and my position. You know, it's like these moralist conversations like, yeah, but you own an apartment, yes, but you earn money and you say you are a communist. This is so absurd. You are an ecologist, but you have a carbon footprint. I mean, this is the way we can paralyze ourselves and not go anywhere. We need to look beyond these things. Our coherence must be a perspective coherence, a coherence of what we can actually do together, not what we are already doing wrong, you know, or right. It's something that we need to look at in perspective. And so no, we shouldn't reconcile, and we should keep bringing up the crap wherever we see it. I mean, the problem is that we have normalized so many things, and things are normal. So we just need to trust our own experience of what oppression is, or of what, you know, this thing that Delphi was saying. You know, there's no science that will tell us you're oppressed, but we can share it and agree on something, and we need to teach this to the others, and that will make them become finally better persons.
Thank you. I completely agree with you, Fulvia. So we need to start closing it. We could like go on, and I would have loved that we were the three of us together with the audience live, so we could like have time and spend time and talk and then going for some drinks, though it's very early in Mexico for drinks. But anyway, but I would love, Prashani, if you could like also close. I mean, there's like so many ideas that we have like in the head right now, as I know that we're working on some of these But if you would like to close it.
Well, I think there's no way to close discussion on these issues. And I think this, in the spirit of this conversation, we should end on the note that we must continue in this vein to even fight with each other about these ideas, but in a way that doesn't reproduce what's imposed on us, but allows us to produce a form of emancipatory care, in your words. So I do hope that we will be together physically sometime soon, in Italy, Mexico, or South Africa, or maybe all three. Michael Hart once said in a conversation years ago that we should put our minds together to developing a properly thought through research, a set of research engagements across the three countries. Maybe that what was once a dream might sometime happen soon.
That sounds wonderful.
Thank you, Claire. It was Claire Fontaine. Thank you, Fulvia, and Claire Fontaine. And yeah, I'm looking forward to what comes from here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of you. It has been an amazing journey to work with both of you, and I'm so happy to every time I go into the museum and I enter and I see that sign that says "Woman Raised Uprising," and I feel like this energy, this kind infraleve kind of Duchamp notion of energy moving, and I can feel the other women in the public feeling it as well. Like there's something that is changing. There's lots of things that are changing. There's a lot of energy for emancipation and freedom in so many ways today, even though we're in a very, very dark time. So I hope these words and these lights that comes from your work of art and your ideas can help us to keep struggling for our freedom. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And ahora, después de esto, a las 12 hay una mesa redonda con artistas maravillosas, Daniela Ortiz, Ana Gallardo.
After this at 12, there's a round table, a marvelous round table with Galindo, Gallardo, and Ortiz, the great artist Volker. So I hope that you can be with us.
See you guys soon. Thank you, Prashani. This is the last participation of you. Indeed. Thank you so much for all your time. It's late in Johannesburg right now, so thank you for being late.
No, it's a pleasure being here.
Bye. Thank you.